The final echoes of the graduation ceremony still hung in the air like distant thunder as Walter Jenkins pushed his broom slowly across the gymnasium floor. The crowd had dissipated. The caps had been tossed, and the last triumphant note of pomp and circumstance had faded nearly an hour earlier. Now silence reigned. The bleachers stood half-folded. Stray programs littered the ground, and empty plastic cups rolled along the floor like tumbleweeds across an abandoned plane. The balloons, once weightless with celebration, now drooped lazily from the rafters. Walter had seen it all before. For over 3 decades, he had worked as a janitor at Fairview High School, a quiet figure with calloused hands and a back bent not just by age, but by years of lifting, hauling, and cleaning up after hundreds of teenagers. He had watched generations cross the very stage that stood now, dimly lit and half forgotten. There had been years of laughter, tears, broken hearts, vandalized lockers, prom nights gone wrong, and final exams gone worse. And through it all, Walter had been there, always the first to arrive, always the last to leave. He moved with a kind of worn-out grace, scooping up crumpled napkins, folding up the last of the metal chairs, and stacking them into neat rows along the gym wall. He paused for a moment near the center of the court, looking up toward the stage. The spotlight had been turned off, but few of the overhead lights still shone down, casting faint shadows across the worn wooden boards. The podium stood silent, the microphone angled down as if bowing after its performance. Walter let out a small sigh, brushing a speck of dust off his blue work shirt. His name patch, Walter J., was frayed at the edges, stitched on a lifetime ago. No one had called him by his full name in years. Around here, he was just Mr. Jenkins or the janitor, or, most often, not noticed at all. Still, there was a pride he carried that no applause could replace. It lived in the way he kept the halls gleaming, in how he knew the building's every creak and hum, in how he could fix a busted water fountain with nothing but a wrench and instinct. He didn't ask for recognition. Never had. This place had been his work, his rhythm, his home. As he finished sweeping the center court, he leaned on the broom handle and took a slow, satisfied breath. The gym smelled of confetti, sweat, and teenage dreams. He had always liked the way it smelled after graduation. It was a scent of something ending, yes, but also of something beginning. Though his part remained the same every year, the show never failed to move him. He turned toward the bleachers, ready to collect the last few scattered items when he noticed something odd. The stage lights, 2 of them, were still on. He squinted. Was someone still there? He hadn't heard any footsteps. Before he could call out, he heard the distinct pop of the sound system waking up. A microphone clicked on, buzzing faintly through the speakers that hung from the ceiling. Walter paused, one foot slightly raised, caught mid-step. Maybe a student had forgotten something. Maybe one of the teachers was running a test. But then he heard it. A voice. Clear, firm, and emotional. "Hi, sorry," the voice said, slightly nervous at first but quickly steadying. "I know the program ended, and I know everyone's on their way out. But if you're still here, if you can still hear me, I'd like to say something." Walter froze. That voice, he recognized it. Lauren Michaels, the class valedictorian, top of her class, leader of the debate team, bound for Yale in the fall. He had seen her almost every morning, passing by the janitor's closet with a coffee in hand, always polite, always focused. Lauren stood at the center of the stage now, one hand wrapped around the microphone, her graduation cap slightly tilted. Her eyes scanned the gym, not looking for a crowd, but for someone in particular. "I gave my speech earlier," she continued, "and I thank my teachers, my parents, my friends, but I left out someone who deserved to be thanked the most. Someone who never got a round of applause. Someone who's probably still working while we celebrate." Walter's heart kicked in his chest. He stood completely still. He's the first to open the doors and the last to leave every day. He's cleaned up after our mistakes. He's fixed what we've broken. He's made sure this building felt like home. Walter looked around. The gym was mostly empty, but a few heads had turned back through the side doors, drawn by the sound of her voice. A cluster of parents had stopped near the exit. Teachers paused mid-conversation. Lauren's eyes stopped wandering. They locked onto him. "Mr. Walter Jenkins," she said, her voice trembling slightly but full of warmth. "You've been here longer than most of us have been alive. And today we want to say thank you." Walter blinked. Once. Twice. He was still holding his broom, his hand tightened around the handle, as if to keep himself grounded. A murmur passed through the gym. The few people who had remained inside began to clap, softly at first, but growing. Doors swung open again as others re-entered, drawn by the unexpected speech. Walter didn't move. He wasn't sure he could. But the lights were on. The spotlight had found him. And for the first time in over 30 years, Walter Jenkins was not invisible. He was being seen, truly seen, and the moment was only just beginning. For a few long seconds, Walter remained frozen near the edge of the gymnasium floor. The broom in his hand felt heavier now, as if burdened by decades rather than wood and bristles. The applause was no longer just a scattering of polite claps. It was growing, swelling, rising into something far more profound. He saw parents returning from the parking lot, teachers stepping out from side doors, students re-entering the gym, their gowns rustling as they moved. And at the center of it all stood Laura Michaels, her gaze never leaving his. She spoke again, her voice no longer hesitant but steady, like someone delivering a truth long overdue. "We always walked past him. Some of us said good morning. Some didn't, but he always showed up, every single day. Before the sun, after the bell, after the games, the dances, the messes we left behind. He was there." Walter took a slow step forward. He didn't know why. Maybe because the weight of standing still had become too much, or maybe because something in her tone pulled him toward the stage like gravity. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, and yet somehow it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like warmth, a recognition that had never been spoken aloud until now. Lauren took a short breath and continued, her voice catching slightly. "When we cried in the bathroom and thought no one could hear us, he was there. When the toilet overflowed during homecoming and we laughed it off, he fixed it before the next bell. When the hallway lights went out or the heater broke or the ceiling leaked, he handled it quietly, always quietly." The principal, Mr. Rayburn, appeared at the edge of the stage, arms crossed but eyes gentle. Behind him, a few members of the school board stood with small smiles. Clearly, they had known this was coming. Walter, however, had not. His world had always been behind the curtain, never beneath the spotlight. Lauren looked down for a moment, then lifted her head and searched for his eyes again. We talk a lot about the people who shape us, teachers, coaches, mentors. But today, I want to talk about someone who held us up without ever asking to be seen. Someone who showed us what dignity looks like, what consistency means, what it is to serve without expectation. Walter was now halfway to the stage, slow but steady, his shoes barely making a sound against the wooden floor. The clapping continued, joined now by murmurs and nods and the occasional quiet tear. The moment had shifted from a student's speech to something more sacred, an offering of gratitude long overdue. Lauren stepped aside from the podium, gesturing subtly for him to come forward. "Mr. Jenkins," she said more softly now, "would you mind joining us for a moment?" He hesitated at the bottom of the stage stairs. He'd been around this platform thousands of times, sweeping confetti, fixing loose wires, adjusting microphones before assemblies. But he had never stood on it. Not like this. A few nearby students, without being asked, gently took the broom from his hand and offered him a supportive glance. He nodded faintly and took the steps one at a time. The stage lights weren't blinding. They were warm, and when he reached the top, he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his throat. Lauren turned toward the crowd again. "We decided," she said, her voice ringing through the gym, "that today couldn't end without honoring someone who made it possible for the rest of us to succeed. And though it's not printed in the program, I'd like to ask you all to join me in giving a proper thank you to Mr. Walter Jenkins." The applause erupted again, stronger now, louder, uncontainable. Students stood, some whistling, some clapping above their heads. Teachers wiped at the corners of their eyes. Parents, perhaps reminded of their own quiet heroes, joined in without reservation. Walter turned toward Lauren, who stepped closer and, in a lower voice meant just for him, said, "You matter, sir." We see you, and we wanted you to know that. He nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you, he whispered, barely audible, though Lauren heard it. Behind them, Principal Rayburn stepped forward and handed Lauren a small box and an envelope. She accepted them, then turned to Walter. We know you're not one for speeches, she said gently, but if it's okay, we have a gift. She handed him the envelope first. Walter opened it slowly, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. Inside was a neatly folded letter printed on school stationery. He glanced at the first few lines, and his brow furrowed with confusion, then shock. This, Lauren said for the benefit of the audience, is a letter officially announcing the creation of the Walter Jenkins Opportunity Grant. It's a scholarship fund started by our graduating class for students who want to pursue careers in maintenance, facility management, engineering, or school operations. Fields that, like Walter, often go unnoticed but are always essential. Gasps and applause spread through the room again. Walter looked at the page, eyes scanning words that refused to register. Then he opened the box. Inside was a check, $38,000. He blinked several times, trying to make sense of it. We raised this online over the last few months, Lauren explained, now visibly emotional herself. For you, for the man who gave so much and never asked for anything back. Walter stared at the check, then at her, then out across the gym. His mouth opened, then closed. His hands trembled slightly. The applause had quieted as the crowd waited for him to speak. Just a few words, anything. He leaned toward the microphone, still unsure, still overwhelmed. Then, in a voice cracked by age and emotion, he said quietly, I don't know what to say. Lauren stepped back, giving him space. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of gratitude, full of memories, full of moments that now, finally, belonged to him. Walter looked out at the faces. So many of them familiar, and though his words were few, his presence said more than any speech ever could. And then, slowly, gently, he whispered something else. Something that would echo beyond the walls of that gym. But that was still to come. A hush fell across the gymnasium the moment Walter's name left Lauren's lips. It was not the kind of silence born from confusion or obligation, but rather one filled with reverence, like the collective intake of breath when witnessing something quietly profound. For all the years he had pushed his broom through those halls, it had always been under the radar, like wind through trees or footsteps in a distant hallway. Now, with the echo of his full name resonating from the stage, it was as if the entire school had been momentarily reminded of something they had never truly seen. The crowd reacted first with stillness, and then, almost as if some emotional dam had been lifted, with a slow wave of applause that started in the back corner and swelled to every inch of the gym. Students, faculty, and parents, those who had lingered, those who had started to leave, even some already outside, filtered back in, drawn by the sound. Some returned because they were curious, some because they sensed something important was happening, and others because, deep down, they realized they had been a part of something they had never properly acknowledged. Walter stood near the edge of the stage, his fingers still brushing the envelope and check he had just received. But it wasn't the money or the scholarship that held him in place. It was the recognition. He didn't move because he wasn't quite sure how to. His name had been said aloud, not mumbled in passing or scribbled on a work order, but spoken with intent, broadcast into the open air of a room that had never truly seen him. The sound of it, Walter Jenkins, seemed to bounce off the rafters and settle into every ear, every memory, every heart. From the side entrance, a cluster of seniors still in their gowns re-entered the gym and immediately began to clap. Others stood from their seats. Some had phones out, not in a performative way, but to record what had clearly become the emotional climax of the ceremony. Teachers looked at one another and shook their heads with that particular mixture of shame and admiration, realizing they, too, had let years go by without saying what should have always been said. Lauren stepped back slightly to give Walter the space he deserved, her eyes never leaving his. Behind her, the school principal and several administrators looked on, visibly moved. They knew what was coming next. Walter didn't. He could never have expected this. From behind the stage curtain, 2 staff members appeared, carrying a small table draped in a dark blue cloth bearing the school's emblem. They placed it near the center of the stage and carefully positioned an engraved plaque atop it. The plaque read, "In honor of Walter Jenkins, for over 30 years of unwavering service, quiet strength, and unmatched devotion to Fairview High School. You kept our halls clean, our spirits lifted, and our school whole." Walter turned slowly to face it, his eyes settling on the letters like they were a foreign language. He had spent his life mending broken things, solving quiet problems, patching leaks no one ever saw. He had never expected anyone to memorialize that. Principal Rayburn stepped forward now and offered his hand. "Walter," he said, keeping his voice low but clear, "this plaque will be mounted right outside the main office next week, permanently, right where every student and visitor will pass by it. We want them to know your name, to know your story. You've been part of the soul of this place, and it's time people saw that." Walter shook his hand, the gesture slow, deliberate. His fingers were calloused from decades of work, and he had never worn gloves. Now, those hands were being honored not just for what they had built and cleaned, but for what they had represented. Lauren, still beside him, held the microphone and glanced out at the growing crowd. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The silence, the plaque, the eyes of everyone watching, it all spoke for itself. Walter looked down at the small box again, the check inside catching the overhead light. $38,000. He didn't quite know what he would do with it. It wasn't the kind of money that changed the world, but it could change a life. Maybe a better truck. Maybe some repairs on the little house he had lived in since his wife passed away. Maybe something for his granddaughter. But none of that seemed urgent now. He cleared his throat and moved slightly closer to the microphone. His mouth was dry, and he wasn't sure if he'd be able to speak without his voice betraying him. But he felt he needed to try, not because he wanted the spotlight he never had, but because something in him wanted to meet the moment. When he began to speak, his voice was rough but sincere. "I ain't much for speeches," he said, and a few gentle chuckles rippled through the crowd. "Never thought I'd be on this side of the stage." He paused, looking out at the students, faces both familiar and unfamiliar. Some he had known for 4 years, some just in passing, but he remembered them all in his own quiet way. "I've been here a long time, long enough to see a whole lot of you come and go, and I've watched this place change more than once. But one thing never changed, how much I care about this school." There was a stillness in the room that didn't feel heavy. It felt like listening. "I cleaned up after your parties. I fixed what got broken. I've been here when no one else was. And that was enough for me. Didn't expect nothing more." His hand tightened slightly on the microphone. "But hearing my name today, hearing it said out loud like it mattered, that means more than I can say." He looked down, then back up again, his eyes shining. "You all went out of your way to notice someone the world don't usually see. That takes heart, and I won't forget it." A moment of silence followed, soft and sacred. Then, someone in the crowd, an older teacher near the back, stood up and began to clap again. Others followed. In seconds, the entire gym was on its feet once more. Walter didn't bow or wave. He simply nodded, the kind of gesture that comes from a place deeper than performance. A gesture of real gratitude. As the applause continued, he stood there, no longer just a man who cleaned the halls, but someone who had been woven into the very story of the school. And he hadn't yet said the words that would change everything. But they were coming. The applause eventually softened, tapering into murmurs of awe and reflection. But the emotion in the room remained thick and tangible. Walter still stood near the microphone, the weight of the moment pressing gently against his chest. He could feel it more than he could explain it. A swell of gratitude, a heat rising behind his eyes that he wasn't quite ready to release. Around him, the stage had shifted from a place of formality to one of quiet reverence, transformed not by ceremony, but by truth spoken aloud. Principal Rayburn stepped forward again, but this time his expression was softer, almost paternal. He carried a manila folder in one hand and a small wrap box in the other, and his voice dropped to a warm, measured tone. "Walter," he began, "there's something else we'd like to share with you, something that was never planned in any official curriculum, but felt right in every way." He handed Walter the folder first. Inside, Resting neatly against the pale paper was a second letter, this one signed not only by Rayburn but by the school board, several faculty members, and the entire graduating class. It detailed the creation of the Walter Jenkins Opportunity Grant, but unlike the brief mention Lauren had given, this letter went deeper. It included testimonies from students who had seen Walter mop up their spills without complaint, from teachers who returned late to their classrooms only to find the trash already emptied and the lights respectfully dimmed, from a guidance counselor who'd once overheard Walter humming to himself in the hallway after fixing a broken heater on a snow day. More than logistics, the letter carried intention. This scholarship would live on annually, not as a one-time gesture, but as an enduring reminder of the unseen pillars of every community. A committee would be formed, 3 students, 2 faculty, and 1 alumni, tasked with awarding the grant to someone who not only needed financial support, but who embodied the same selflessness Walter had shown over 3 decades. Walter read the opening lines, but he didn't need to reach the end to feel its weight. His lips parted slightly, his eyes fixed on the page as though it might vanish if he blinked. Behind him, a few students whispered quietly, and one teacher gently dabbed at her cheeks with his sleeve. Rayburn then handed him the small wrap box. "And this," he said with a subtle smile, "is just from us. No committees, no approval, just a thank you." Walter carefully untied the ribbon and peeled away the paper, revealing a polished wooden box. Inside lay a silver watch, simple, elegant, and clearly engraved. He lifted it, turning it in his hand until the inscription came into view. It read, "To Walter Jenkins, for the time you gave, the care you offered, and the difference you made." Walter looked at it in silence for a long moment. He had owned only one other watch in his life, a gift from his late wife when he retired from his first job at a grain elevator. That watch no longer ticked, but he had kept it tucked in a drawer at home, never quite able to part with it. Now, standing on a stage in front of hundreds, he held another symbol of time, not just past, but honored. Before he could speak, a rustle from the crowd drew his attention. Students were making their way toward the stage, not in chaos, but in an organized, intentional flow. One by one, they lined up, approaching slowly. Lauren stepped back, letting them take the lead. The first was a boy Walter vaguely recognized from shop class, a quiet student who rarely spoke above a whisper. He reached out, offered a firm handshake, and said simply, "Thank you." The next, a girl from the drama club, always expressive and full of energy, hugged him without hesitation. "You were always there," she whispered, "even when I thought no one was." Then another, and another. Hands, hugs, tears, laughter. One by one they came, a line that stretched across the floor and out to the gym doors, winding back into the hallway where the scent of old varnish and youth lingered. Faculty joined the line too. Teachers, aides, cafeteria workers. Even the school nurse, who had worked alongside Walter for over 20 years, clasped his hand with both of hers and didn't say a word, because she didn't need to. Walter remained standing, receiving each person with a quiet grace. He responded to every thank you with a nod, a soft smile, sometimes a name if he remembered it. He didn't cry, not yet, but his eyes were red, and his chest rose and fell with deeper breaths than usual. For a man who had lived in the background, the sudden gravity of being at the center of something so genuine was almost disorienting. When the line finally thinned and the last student walked away, Walter took a step back from a microphone. His hand brushed the envelope containing the check, $38,000, raised by students who, until that day, he believed barely noticed him. He glanced toward Lauren, who was still nearby, watching quietly, her eyes glistening. She gave him a small nod, an unspoken encouragement to speak if he wanted to. Walter turned slowly back to the microphone. His voice, when it came, was steadier than before. "I've been in this gym more times than I can count. I've cleaned it top to bottom. I've fixed lights up in the rafters, mopped puddles off this floor after pep rallies, picked up the pieces after the music stopped and the balloons came down." He paused and ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. "But I never stood here thinking any of you were watching. Not really. I figured I was just part of the background, a part that didn't need much notice." He looked at the plaque, then the watch, then the folded letters in his hand. But today you noticed. You saw me, and I can't tell you what that means." He took a breath, his voice softening. "I'm not standing here because I wanted attention. I'm standing here because you gave me something I never expected. You made me feel seen. And that's a powerful thing." There was a silence again, thick with emotion, until Walter, almost inaudibly, said something that brought it all back into focus. "You all gave me dignity today, and I'll carry that with me the rest of my life." A beat passed. Then came the first tear, silent, warm, and unashamed. It traced a path down his weathered cheek, carving through the years like a quiet exhale. He didn't wipe it away, because some moments don't need to be cleaned up. They just need to be lived. And just then, the final word was his to say. As the crowd settled once more and the gymnasium's energy shifted from celebration to reverence, Walter remained at the microphone, his hand resting gently against its slender frame. A silence had returned, not empty but full, pregnant with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that still hung unspoken in the air. The applause had faded. The speeches had ended. The honors had been given. But there was something else, something that stirred in Walter's chest like a whisper rising from deep inside, asking not for permission, but for release. He didn't glance at the audience this time. He didn't need to. His eyes remained fixed somewhere ahead of him, unfocused, as if staring at memory rather than a person. He drew in a slow breath, steadying himself not out of fear but out of respect. For the moment, for the truth he was about to share, and for the young voices who had, for the first time, called his name in gratitude. "I never thought," he began, his voice quiet but unwavering, "that I'd stand up here like this. I never thought there'd be a reason." There was no dramatic shift in tone, no sudden swelling of music or grand gesture. Just Walter's voice, raw, plain, and real. "I've walked these halls since 1987. I've mopped the floors after football games, cleaned up shattered glass after a fight outside the cafeteria, held open doors during fire drills in the pouring rain. I've patched up walls, scrubbed graffiti, and once even chased a raccoon out of the teacher's lounge." A soft ripple of laughter passed through the crowd, gentle and genuine. "But what most of you never knew is, I was never supposed to be here this long." He paused, letting the silence settle again. "I took this job after I lost my son." The sentence dropped like a stone into still water. There was no sound in the gym but the hum of distant air vents and the breath of those listening. His name was Caleb. He was 8 years old. A sweet boy. Curious. Quiet like me. Got sick fast. We didn't even have time to fight it. Walter blinked slowly. His fingers pressed into the edge of the podium. After he passed, I couldn't go back to the factory. Couldn't go back to a house full of toys that didn't get played with anymore. I needed something else. Something steady. Something quiet. The school gave me that. The emotion in his voice didn't crack dramatically. It folded softly, like an old blanket wrapped around a wound long scarred over. I started here thinking I'd stay a year. Maybe 2. Just enough to keep myself moving. But something happened I didn't expect. He looked up now, his eyes sweeping the room. "You all became my second family." He gestured slightly toward the bleachers, toward the hallways beyond the gym. Every kid who snuck in late, every prank that left a mess, every senior prank that got out of hand. I was there, and I wasn't angry. I was grateful, because every hallway I swept reminded me that life keeps going. That laughter still echoes. That kids still run when the bell rings. More than a few people in the crowd had tears now. Not just students, but parents, teachers, and staff who had worked alongside him for years and had never heard a word of this. "And I watched you," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of you. I saw when you were having a bad day. I heard the tears in the bathroom stalls. I noticed who held the doors for each other and who didn't. I saw which of you stayed behind to help pick up after events, and which of you rushed out first. I noticed, not to judge, but because noticing, it made me feel useful again." He cleared his throat softly, but didn't step away. "I didn't have a voice in your classrooms. I didn't teach math or science or literature. I didn't grade papers or coach teams. But I was here, and every smile, every nod in the hallway, every Thank you I got over the years, even the ones that seemed like nothing meant everything. Then he leaned slightly closer to the microphone, his voice even quieter. I never thought anyone would notice me, but I noticed each and every one of you. The stillness in the gym turned reverent, not frozen, but holding its breath. A few quiet sobs could be heard, but no one interrupted him. No one shifted in their seat. I'm not speaking up here because I want sympathy. I'm speaking because you gave me something today I never expected to feel again. You made me feel remembered. He turned his head toward Lauren now, his eyes full of gratitude. Miss Michaels, you didn't just give me a moment. You gave me back my name. She gave him a small nod, her own expression unreadable except for the sheen in her eyes. Walter stepped away from the microphone then, not abruptly, but with the quiet grace of a man who had said everything he needed to say. As he moved down the stairs, students instinctively opened a path for him, but not in distance, only in reverence. Several reached out as he passed, shaking his hand, patting his back, murmuring soft thanks. At the bottom of the stage, just as he began walking toward the exit, a student, no one quite saw who, shouted from the crowd, "We should have done this a long time ago." The words hit like a final punctuation on an unspoken truth. The crowd responded, not with claps this time, but with nods, with a ripple of shared acknowledgement. There was no guilt in the air, only resolution. Walter had never asked to be seen, but now that he had been, he never would be forgotten. He reached the gym doors slowly, turning once to glance back. The lights on the stage still glowed softly. A few students had remained behind, chatting, wiping their eyes, some still looking his way. And then he did what he always did. He picked up the broom resting against the wall. Not because he had to, not anymore, but because it had been a part of him for so long, and he wasn't ready to let go of it just yet. This time, though, he didn't sweep. He just carried it with him. And when he stepped out of the gym, the weight in his heart was lighter than it had been in decades.